Hey everybody, Mr. Mitchell here, ready to walk you through the key concept of AP European History's Period 1, 1450 to 1648. The way this is going to work is I'm going to take you through 5 main ideas or key concepts put forth by the College Board about ways to think about this particular period of European history. And then within each of these key concepts, I'm going to go through, some supporting materials, just the details, so to speak, of European history that kind of fits. Still kind of going at a pretty generalized level, um, working in some specific details here as well. But this is based upon the content outline from College Board for AP European History. And that is the document that kind of says this is the information that kids need to know in order to be successful on the national exam. So each time I pop up a key concept here, I'm going to encourage you to pause the video and do some brainstorming, some free association. Maybe get a pencil and a pen, or pencil, pen, paper, all those good things, and jot down what comes to mind, some free association for each of these key concepts. And then I'll go through and touch on some of the information related to it. So it's kind of a good way to test yourself and see how you do. Just because I don't mention something doesn't mean it's not relevant, but it is just kind of a good exercise to activate some of that old knowledge. So first up, what is that first key concept we're going to take a look at? Basically, key concept 1.1. The rediscovery of works from ancient Greece and Rome and the observation of the natural world changed many Europeans' views of their world. So within this idea, the first thing we need to focus on here is the revival of classical texts. It led to new methods of scholarship and new values in both society and religion. Big movement to associate with this is the humanists. A name to associate would be Petrarch, kind of considered the father of humanism. Just know that this was the promotion of classical literature, the old school stuff from the ancient Greeks and Romans. It's leading to increased secularism and individualism within Renaissance society. Also, this new information, these classical texts, this movement, this is going to challenge the power of traditional institutions of information, like the university system and the Catholic Church. And it is going to shift education away from a primary focus on theological writings and moving more into what would eventually be known as the humanities. Furthermore, another effect of these texts is this idea of civic humanism, that each man of society kind of has his responsibility to develop himself to the fullest and use those benefits not just for his personal gain, but for the benefit of his community. Next big idea, the invention of the printing press promoted the dissemination of new ideas. So the printing press, hopefully you can associate that around 1450, aided, maybe Johannes Gutenberg, aided in the spreading of the Renaissance across Italy, and eventually the spread of these humanist writings into the rest of Europe as well. When we talk about visual arts of the Renaissance, big things here. New ideas used to promote personal, political, and religious goals. The advances in Renaissance painting, first, much more focus on realism and depicting nature as it really is. Also, though, borrowing a lot from classical styles. Now, the Greeks and Romans weren't big on painting, but sculpture definitely. And you look at a lot of Renaissance painting, and it looks like sculpture. It's got that depth. A key aspect there is also geometric perspective, but really focusing on not just realism, but perfection, an idealized realism of the human form and of nature. Now, in the Northern Renaissance, remember, their work is going to be a little bit more often religious, but at the same time, it's also going to focus on more kind of the everyday individuals in everyday life. Even if you're talking about a saint, the way that they're going to be depicted is a little bit more everyday in its nature. And then remember, at the end of the Renaissance, as far as artistic movements, you have Mannerist and Baroque. These are characterized by a lot of drama, a lot of high contrast lighting, a lot of diagonal lines. And remember, it's that Baroque art that really kind of becomes the propaganda campaign of the Catholic Church, trying to win back followers, get them excited about Catholicism through the work of those Baroque painters. Another big idea when we talk about key concept 1 here, new ideas in science and observation. So this is, we're incorporating names like Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton when we think about astronomy. But also William Harvey when we're thinking about anatomy and physiology and understanding the body better than, say, Galen and his humors. Sir Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes, responsible for really advocating for, inductive and deductive reasoning, respectively. And ultimately, when you kind of take those two ways of thinking together, combine it with the way that Newton approached his scientific inquiry, you're going to end up with something that starts to look a lot like our modern scientific method. But remember, with these new scientific thinking minds, they weren't really the severe science of the 20th century. Alchemy, astrology, still very popular. Why? Maybe because, it, just like the new science, it had a notion of the predictable and a knowable universe. It's just those things were based upon assertions that weren't directly physically testable and observable. Okay, moving on. Key concept 2. Key concept 1.2, I mean. Religious pluralism challenged the concept of a unified Europe. So again, I encourage you to pause the video, do a little free association, see what sort of names and places and events, ideas that you could associate with key concept 2, and then we'll dive right in. All right. First big thing that should come to mind is this idea of Protestant and Catholic reformations, fundamentally changing theology, changing religious institutions and attitudes towards wealth and prosperity. But before we get to Luther and Calvin, we should probably talk about Erasmus and Christian humanism. This idea of really kind of taking some of the intellectual nature of the Renaissance and applying it towards the church. Here it was about, how can we use Catholicism to create a better society? How can we improve upon Catholicism as well? How can we be thoughtful? How can we make the most of this? So don't forget about Erasmus before we get into Luther and Calvin. Now, obviously, Martin Luther, 95 Thesis, 1517, that's a big one we need to know. John Calvin, not far behind, over in Switzerland, also kind of putting his own spin upon this idea of salvation in the Christian church. These are new interpretations of Christian doctrine and practice. Both are basing it, exclusively upon Scripture, not what hundreds of years of Catholic popes and cardinals and bishops have interpreted the Scripture to mean. So focusing directly on the Word of God. That's where Luther and Calvin are coming from. Also, don't forget when we talk about Protestantism, this idea of kind of the Protestant work ethic, and that wealth accumulation, could be a sign of God's favor. That there's this relationship between prosperity and salvation. Now, that can be a little difficult when you think about indulgences and the role that they play in the Reformation. But that was part of it, and that idea of the Protestant work ethic. And then also remember the Catholic Reformation, sometimes called the Counter-Reformation. This is where the leadership of the Catholic Church, Pope Paul II, the Jesuits, the Council of Trent, all efforts to try to do a little internal reform of Catholicism, but also kind of put their foot down and say, no, these are not things we're willing to compromise on. And ultimately, the Counter-Reformation was pretty darn successful in bringing a lot of people back and a lot of territory back to the Catholic Church. Also understand this idea that, the Reformation is going to kind of challenge the relationship between church and state. A couple of folks to think about here: Henry VIII, and Elizabeth I of England, both kind of initiating a religious reform from top down in order to exercise greater control over the church. Um, Think about some Protestant groups like the Calvinists or the Anabaptists who refused to recognize the subordinate nature of church to state. The Anabaptists were, kind of the idea they were going to separate from the state and kind of have their own faith-based societies. And just understand that, yes, now this relationship between political institutions and religious institutions is only going to get more tumultuous than it had been in the late Middle Ages. Conflict. Now, conflict between religious groups is going to overlap with political and economic causes as well. When you think about the French wars of religion, when you think about the English Civil War, obviously Protestantism and Catholicism or the Huguenots, that's going to play a major role in things. When you think about the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburgs, they're going to, at one time or simultaneously, they're going to be trying to defend themselves against the expanding Ottoman Empire, political reasons there, but while also trying to kind of hold up Catholic unity across the Holy Roman Empire. And then another example would be France. How do we deal with the division between the Catholics and the Huguenots? Well, you remember the Edict of Nantes as a compromise to try to create stability within the state. If one faith could not be asserted, the logical thing to do would be to make room for both. Okay, so I wanted to work in a little bit of exam practice here as well. So I'm going to flash up a practice SRQ or SAQ. Remember, these are going to come to you in 3 parts or 3 tasks. Each of these tasks should be about a paragraph, 2 really good sentences, 3 standard sentences, but you want to identify a legitimate answer here. You want to explain this answer, what this is that you're talking about, so you should know what you're talking about, and then ultimately you want to explain the significance, the connections, the meaning of the answer that you provided, kind of connect it back to the prompt and show why it is a good answer for that particular part. So you can see we've got a 3-part prompt here talking about wars of religion in France and the English Civil War. So if you want to hit pause on this and do a little practice, right, go for it. Next up, we're going to take on our next key concept. So the next key concept here is going to be key concept 1.3. Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. So again, I'd encourage you, hit pause on the video, do a little free association right here. What sort of names, what sort of places, what sort of things come to mind when you look at this particular key concept. Okay, big ideas within key concept 1.3. First, European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas and to establish colonies. One aspect here is establishing direct access to gold, spices, luxury goods. Europeans had been accessing these things kind of through the Mediterranean trade network, which was based upon the Indian Ocean trade network. But with the rise of the Ottomans, they were having a harder and harder time getting those goods without significant markups. And so now the question was, is there a way to get these things without having to deal with the Ottomans? Maybe we can get a direct supply route to these goods that are, in demand amongst the well-to-do within Europe. Let's think about the rise of mercantilism, giving the state a new role within promoting commercial development within their nation. And a very active hands-on role there is going to be acquiring colonies overseas. And also, don't forget, Christianity was a big stimulus for exploration as well. Not just the Europeans seeing themselves as God's favorite people, but this missionary zeal, especially amongst the Jesuits, Often the missionaries on these ships going to other parts of the world were Jesuits attempting to convert the people there to not just Christianity, but Catholicism. Don't forget all of this exploration during this age was made possible by technological advances, a lot of which were coming from the Arabian Peninsula, as far as the Lantine sails, the caravels, the astrolabe, compass. I guess the compass comes from a lot of different places, but a lot of these technologies from other parts outside Europe were responsible for the Europeans being able to not be coast huggers and to set course across vast bodies of water. Europeans are going to establish overseas empires and trade networks through coercion and negotiation. Some places more coercion, some places more negotiation. But first off, think of the Portuguese. They're going to establish a commercial trade network along the African coast, South and East Asia, and South America, the colony of Brazil, throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. The Spanish are not so much a commercial network, but the Spanish Empire is going to be about colonies, and primarily colonies in the New World. Starting with Columbus, following with Cortes, Pizarro, and many more, they're going to carve out colonies within the Western Hemisphere. The Atlantic nations, France, England, the Dutch, they're going to follow the example, and they're going to kind of do a little bit of both. They're going to do what they can to establish commercial networks in the East, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Far East. They're also going to do what they can to establish colonies in the New World, following Spain's model as well. And ultimately, all of these nations in their mercantilistic interests overlapping, you're going to see a lot of rivalry. You're going to see conflict, direct conflict between European powers over, marking their territories and carving out their share of the markets in these different parts of the world. Ultimately, another big idea about here is just this global exchange of goods. Plants, animals, cultural practices, diseases, all of these things. The world kind of becomes globalized for the first time here. One point would be the center of the European economy shifts from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. It's not so much now about those merchant cities in Italy as it is about Spain and Portugal, England and France, and eventually the Dutch. The other big thing here is the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases that were previously, isolated from the Eastern Hemisphere, is the Columbian Exchange. A lot of biodiversity is going to be kind of introduced here when we talk about food and crops, when we talk about animals, when we talk about humans, when we talk about diseases as well. And this is going to have long-standing impacts on both the people of the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. One of the the grimmest would be the effect that old world diseases would be having on new world populations. And then also don't forget, when we talk about colonization, when we talk about the impacts of disease upon indigenous populations, we also then are going to be talking about really the expansion of African slave trade. Starting with the Portuguese, then the French, and the British. The demand for labor in these colonies, especially in the New World, is going to be immense, and you're going to see millions of Africans forced into labor into other continents for the benefit of European merchants. Okay, key concept for 1.4. We got two more. 1.4 talks about European society and the experiences of everyday life, increasingly shaped by commercial and agricultural capitalism, notwithstanding continued existence of medieval social and economic structures. So again, if you can hit pause, do a little free association, write what sort of things come to mind, what people, what places, what things. When you look at key concept 4, I'll let you kind of get that down on paper, activate that prior knowledge, and then we'll dive into some details. Okay, within this key concept, one main idea here is going to be economic change. It's going to produce new social patterns, but it's not going to change everything. Traditional hierarchy and status will continue. One big change here we talk about in the Renaissance is going to be about banking and finance. Think of the Medici, um, making money off lending money to people in other parts of Italy, and then eventually people in other parts of Northern Europe as well. But this money is going to allow for startup capital. It's going to allow for commercial development. It's going to allow for people to take commercial risk. And all of this is starting to kind of set the foundation for a modern capitalist commercial economy. The other thing that you're going to see here is that the merchants of Italy and other kind of modern capitalism is going to shake the power structures of the traditional feudal system. You're going to have a new commercial economic elite, and so how is this going to affect the traditional way of thinking about money and power? Also, though, those traditional established hierarchies of class and religion and gender and race, those are going to continue throughout this period. It's just those institutions and those hierarchies are going to have to adapt to a changing world. For instances like a new commercial economic elite, or new ideas about the place and status of women and their education within society. Western Europe is going to move towards more of a free peasantry model. After the Black Death, you're going to see peasants, maintaining more traditional rights and a little more economic standing. Whereas in the East, serfdom is going to be codified, and it's going to become more ingrained and entrenched during this time. So you're going to see some major differences in agricultural life and agricultural rights between East and West, kind of, from this point forward. And to the point that in the West, you're going to see, if landlords are going to try to abuse their power against peasantry, they, stood the risk of facing popular peasant revolts. This is also going to lead to the expansion of cities, which often is going to place stress on traditional political and social structures. So very slowly here, we start to see a little bit more urbanization. Continuing population pressures after the Black Death is going to kind of lead to, like we said, pressures, push factors, sending more folks to urban environments. Also, a building commercial economy is going to kind of pull more folks to the city, because that's where those economic opportunities are going to take place. With migrants coming to cities, it's going to pose new challenges on how to organize all these people. And so local governments are going to face new challenges. Craft guilds are going to face new challenges and strained resources. And ultimately, remember, during this time, the sands are shifting under our religious institutions as well. So often local governments are tasked with are given the task of regulating public morality. The family unit is going to remain the primary social structure and economic institution for the early modern Europe. Even though families take many different forms, it does include kind of that nuclear family model. Remember, households are both social and economic units. Usually work is separated by gender, but the roles of each gender are going to be complementary to each other to kind of integrate that unit. And yes, we talked about the Renaissance kind of bringing up new debates about gender roles, and specifically female education and women's roles in family, church, and society. One thing that our text talks about here, as Europeans responded to economic and environmental challenges like the Ice Age, delaying marriage and childbearing becomes a more popular practice. And this ultimately does kind of pump the brakes on population growth a little bit, and does help improve economic conditions. Now, not everybody was delaying marriage, but especially kind of the the elites, the aristocracy, this new middle class that's starting to grow. You do see that become more of a common practice. And in popular culture, leisure activities, rituals reflecting continued popularity of folk ideas are reinforced, sometimes challenging community ties and norms. Um, Leisure activities are going to be continued to be organized around the religious calendar and the agricultural cycle. Local and church authorities continue to enforce kind of community norms through practices like public humiliation. And also during this time, you see kind of, this traditional folk ideas, especially during times of social and economic upheaval, accusations of witchcraft and heresy, which peak in Europe between 1580 and 1650. Okay, now we're on to our last key concept. Just a few ideas with this one. This is the struggle for sovereignty within and among states resulted in varying degrees of political centralization. So hit pause, see what you can come up with here as far as people, places, and things that you can associate with this final key concept. Do a little free association, and we'll get going here in a second. All right, major ideas within this key concept. This new concept of a sovereign state and secular systems of law. These are going to play a central role in the creation of new political institutions. We talked about the new monarchies, where kingdoms are spreading in size and power and scope. They're spreading in their wealth and their power. They're increasing the sizes of their militaries. This is really going to kind of become the modern way. These more sizable kingdoms like Spain, France, England, really kind of putting pressure on other institutions of smaller associations, smaller principalities like the Holy Roman Empire. Don't forget about the Peace of Westphalia, which basically effectively marked the end of this medieval idea of a unified Christendom, that these nations are all unified under the Catholic Church, with the Reformation and the Peace of Westphalia, ultimately kind of breaking that down. This also marks kind of the beginning or the continuation of the end of the Holy Roman Empire, because princes, bishops, and other local leaders are given more control over religion. Also, think about fragmentation within Renaissance Italy. You don't see this unification. You don't see these larger kingdoms growing. And so they're a good example of kind of getting pushed out by these new monarchies, these larger states, this idea of secular sovereignty. You're also going to see competitive state systems are going to lead to new patterns of diplomacy and new styles of warfare. Following the Peace of Westphalia, religion really declines in importance as a cause for warfare. You don't see large-scale religious warfare after the 30 Years' War. As far as military technology goes, new forms of warfare, including infantry, firearms, mobile cannon, more elaborate fortifications. All of this costs a lot of money, so it does rely on those larger sovereign states, heavier taxation, standing armies, bureaucracies. All of these things are going to become, part of the modern political institution. When we talk about these growing monarchies, they're going to bump heads with the church. A prime example here is going to be the English Civil War, conflict between the monarchy, between parliament, between other elites, including within the church over their respective roles. All of that kind of had to get sorted out. All of these kind of building pressures for power led to England having the Civil War that they had. Monarchies are going to face challenges from nobility. That's going to be, when you have a strong monarch, ultimately it's going to come down to in what ways are they able to pacify the nobles within their realms. And they're also going to have to be able to deal with, if they have diverse populations. Think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as an example here, but Are they able to exert control over the people within their realms, and the diversity that they have of social class or religion or national identities or ethnic identities as well? Okay, and right here at the end is just a little bit more exam practice. I have a sample stimulus space multiple choice, that would be based upon some content from period one here. So we'll kind of flash up these three questions here at the end and give you a chance to respond and see how you do. So hopefully there's a lot to cover in these periods. They're very long. They're basically 9 weeks of content. So hopefully this just kind of serves to jog some of some memories, to get some of those key ideas put together. We're going to be providing some review activities as well to really think about what's most important, but while also queuing up some very specific information from period one to get you ready for that national exam. So I hope you enjoyed yourselves here. I hope this was somewhat useful for you, and keep stay posted for period two review coming up next week. I'll see you then.